Number 10. The Takacsik-Tlahuaca head. Some artifacts feel mysterious because we do not understand what they were used for. Others feel dangerous because they seem to appear in the wrong place entirely. That is what makes the Takacsik-Tlahuaca head so unsettling. Discovered in 1933 in central Mexico, this small terracotta head was reportedly found inside a pre-Columbian burial at a site near Toluca, associated with the ancient culture of Calixtlahuaca. On its own, that would not have been especially remarkable. Archaeologists recover ceramic fragments all the time, but the shock came from its style. The head did not look Mesoamerican, it looked Roman. Its features, proportions, and artistic treatment led some specialists to argue that it resembled a Roman figurine head, possibly dating from the early centuries of the Common Era. If that interpretation were true, the implications would be staggering. It would suggest that an object linked to the Roman world somehow crossed the Atlantic long before Columbus entered central Mexico and ended up in an indigenous burial context, not as fantasy, not as legend, as an actual physical object. That possibility immediately made the artifact radioactive in historical terms. Was it proof of transoceanic contact no mainstream narrative had properly accounted for? Was it evidence that the ancient world was more connected than we imagine? Or was it simply a contamination event, a later item somehow mixed into an earlier context through accident, error, or even deception? Those skeptical explanations have remained the safer position, and for understandable reasons. The head was excavated under circumstances that later generations could not fully reconstruct with modern standards. That uncertainty left the door open to doubt. Maybe it was planted, maybe it was intrusive, maybe the burial context was misunderstood. But the object itself refused to disappear. Because even skeptics were left with an uncomfortable fact. The head really does look uncannily Roman. The style is not vaguely foreign. It feels specific, too specific for comfort. And once that is acknowledged, the mind immediately moves to possibilities history would rather avoid. Could a Roman-era object have travelled through shipwreck, drifting trade networks, or accidental contact? Could a lost voyage have left behind no written record that survived? Could one tiny artifact be the last surviving fragment of a contact so brief and chaotic that it never became history at all? Those questions are exactly why the Takacsik-Tlahuaca head remains so fascinating. It does not conclusively rewrite the past, but it does something almost as troubling. It opens a crack in the wall, and once that crack is visible, even the smallest object can make an entire timeline feel less secure. Number 9. The Ulfberts swords. There are few things more revealing than a weapon. A weapon tells you what a civilization could build, what it feared, and how far its technology had advanced under pressure. That is why the Ulfbert swords feel so out of place. Not because they are merely old, but because they seem too good for the age that made them. These legendary blades, found across parts of northern and central Europe, and dated roughly between the 9th and 11th centuries, carry an inscription in the blade that reads, in various forms, plus ULFBERH plus T. At first glance, that might sound like a blacksmith's mark or the medieval equivalent of a brand name. But the deeper researchers looked, the stranger the swords became. Some of them were made from exceptionally high-quality steel, with a purity and carbon content that stood far above what was common in Europe at the time. In an age when many swords were still relatively inconsistent in composition and vulnerable to weakness, these blades could be flexible, strong, and devastatingly effective. Their metallurgy gave them a reputation that has only grown with modern analysis. Compared to the standard expectations of the Viking Age, certain Ulfbert swords feel almost premature, like an industrial whisper inside a medieval battlefield. That has led to one of the great puzzles surrounding them. How were they made? One theory points eastward. Perhaps the raw material, or even forged steel of superior quality, came through long-distance trade routes connected to crucible steel traditions beyond Europe, possibly from regions where advanced steel production was already better understood. If so, the Ulfberht swords may not be evidence of impossible invention, but of rare access. Access to materials, knowledge, and exchange networks far more sophisticated than popular imagination usually grants the early medieval world. But that explanation, while plausible, does not make the mystery vanish. It only transforms it. Because even if the answer is trade, that still means somebody in this supposedly brutal and technologically limited age was acquiring extraordinary material, shaping it into elite weapons, marking it with a recognizable name, and distributing it widely enough for the pattern to survive across centuries. That is not a simple blacksmith story. That is a glimpse of prestige manufacturing, guarded knowledge, and technological asymmetry inside a world often reduced to crude stereotypes. And there is another layer to the enigma. Not all Ulfberht swords are equal. Some appear to be genuine masterpieces. Others seem to be imitations, lower quality copies, attempting to borrow the prestige of the name. In other words, these blades may represent not just superior technology, but one of the earliest known examples of a weapon so respected that it inspired counterfeits. That detail makes the whole story feel even more modern. A high-performance product, a powerful name, authentic versions and cheap copies, international circulation, metallurgical advantages ahead of the curve. It begins to sound less like the Dark Ages and more like a shadow of a much more connected, competitive world. The Ulfberht swords may not literally break the timeline, but they do break a certain fantasy about the past. They remind us that history is not a straight staircase from primitive to advanced. Sometimes excellence appears early, burns brightly, and then slips partially out of reach again. And when that happens, an object does not just survive, it embarrasses the centuries around it. Number 8. The Piri Reis Map. Maps are supposed to reveal what a civilization knows. They are records of reach, memory, and control. That is why certain maps feel so unsettling. They do not just show geography, they show the limits of knowledge at a particular moment in time. And when a map seems to know too much, it becomes far more than parchment and ink. It becomes an accusation against history itself. The Piri Reis map is one of those objects. Drawn in 1513 by the Ottoman admiral and cartographer Piri Reis, the surviving fragment of the map depicts parts of Europe, Africa, and the Atlantic world, along with the coasts of South America. At first glance, that already makes it historically valuable. This was an age of exploration, collision, and expanding global contact. Cartographers were scrambling to assemble information from sailors, older charts, imperial records, and rumour. But what pushed the map into legend was the claim that it appeared to preserve knowledge no one should have possessed with such precision. Some observers became fixated on the southern portions of the map, arguing that they represented Antarctica, and not merely Antarctica, but an ice-free version of it, as if the coastline had been known long before modern discovery. If true, that would be explosive. It would imply access to extremely ancient geographic knowledge, perhaps inherited from a lost civilization or some forgotten maritime tradition erased from the official story of human exploration. It is a theory so intoxicating that it has refused to die. And yet, the more carefully historians examine the claim, the more cautious they become. Many argue that the supposed Antarctic section is more likely a distorted extension of South America, shaped by the imperfect information and cartographic habits of the age. After all, early modern maps were often compilations rather than clean scientific surveys. Coastlines were stretched, merged, duplicated, or guessed into place. A map could look eerily accurate in one region and wildly speculative in another. The Piri Reis map was almost certainly assembled from multiple sources, some older than others, and Piri Reis himself stated that he used earlier charts when making it. But that explanation, sensible as it is, does not completely drain the object of its power. Because the real fascination of the map may not lie in whether it literally shows Antarctica. It lies in the fact that it reveals a world already saturated with borrowed knowledge. Knowledge layered across empires, sailors, merchants, shipwrecks, war, and memory. A map made in the Ottoman world, drawing from older materials, some possibly connected to Columbus-era exploration and perhaps even earlier traditions, already tells a story far more complex than the simplistic version of discovery most people are taught. And that is where the unease returns. The Peary Race map may not prove that an ancient civilization charted Antarctica, but it does suggest that history often underestimates how information travels, survives, and mutates. A coastline sketched in one era can be copied in another, misunderstood in a third, and rediscovered centuries later with its origins half erased. By then, what looks impossible may actually be the last surviving echo of many lost intermediaries. That possibility is almost as haunting as the bolder theories. Because if the map is not evidence of impossible ancient knowledge, it may still be evidence of something history handles poorly, chains of transmission so broken that we can no longer see how knowledge moved across time. The result is the same unsettling feeling. We look at the artifact and sense that the official timeline is too neat, too confident, too clean for the messy reality that produced it. Number 7. The Lycurgus Cup. Some ancient objects are mysterious because of where they were found. Others are mysterious because of what they do. The Lycurgus Cup belongs to that second category, and it does not merely surprise people. It makes them wonder whether the ancient world understood materials in ways that still feel startlingly modern. At first glance, the cup is already extraordinary. It is a Roman glass cage cup, believed to date to the 4th century CE, intricately carved and visually stunning even before its deeper secret is revealed. The scene wrapped around it depicts the myth of King Lycurgus entangled and punished, giving the object a dramatic and almost theatrical presence. But the real shock comes when light changes. In reflected light, the cup appears green. In transmitted light, it glows a deep, rich red. That color-shifting effect is so striking that modern viewers often react the same way. This cannot be ancient. It feels like a trick of modern materials science, the kind of engineered optical behavior associated with advanced laboratories, nanotechnology, or precision chemical control. And yet the Lycurgus cup is very real and very old. The explanation lies in the glass itself. Tiny particles of gold and silver are suspended within the material, and they interact with light in a way that produces the dramatic change in color depending on how the cup is illuminated. Today, this is often described in terms that make the artifact sound almost impossibly ahead of its time. Roman nanotechnology, ancient materials engineering, a scientific sophistication hidden in decorative art. Those phrases are powerful, but they must be handled carefully. There is no reason to assume Roman craftsmen understood the physics in modern theoretical terms. They may not have known why the effect worked in the language of contemporary science. But that does not make the achievement less astonishing. Because whether by experimentation, inherited workshop knowledge, or closely guarded craft tradition, they produced an effect so refined that it still feels futuristic. That is the crucial point. The cup does not require us to imagine ancient physicists writing equations in secret. It only requires us to admit that practical mastery can outrun formal explanation. And that admission changes how we see the past. Too often ancient craftsmanship is treated as beautiful but limited, impressive yet fundamentally primitive beside modern science. The Lycurgus cup resists that patronizing frame. It reminds us that the ancient world was capable of developing techniques of extraordinary subtlety, even if the reasoning behind them was embedded in craft practice rather than abstract theory. A workshop can preserve genius without leaving behind a textbook. That is what gives the cup its eerie quality. It feels less like an isolated curiosity and more like a surviving fragment from a wider body of knowledge that has mostly vanished. Not necessarily lost science in the sensational sense, but lost expertise, lost recipes, lost methods, lost hands that knew exactly how to coax impossible beauty out of heat, metal, and sand. Once that possibility settles in, the cup becomes more than a marvel. It becomes a warning that history often remembers finished objects while forgetting the systems of skill that made them possible. And perhaps that is why the Lycurgus cup feels like it breaks the timeline. Not because it proves the Romans had modern nanotechnology in the way popular imagination loves to claim, but because it exposes something subtler and more unsettling. The past may have possessed islands of sophistication so advanced, so specialized, and so fragile that later ages could admire the results without fully understanding how they were achieved. Number 6. The Voynich manuscript. There are ancient objects that confuse us because they are damaged, incomplete, or stripped of context. Then there are objects that seem almost deliberately designed to resist understanding. The Voynich manuscript belongs to that darker category. It does not simply conceal its meaning. It performs mystery so perfectly that, for more than a century, it has made scholars, cryptographers, linguists, and obsessives wonder whether they are looking at a masterpiece of hidden knowledge or one of history's most elegant traps. The manuscript takes its modern name from Wilfrid Voynich, the rare book dealer who acquired it in the early 20th century. But the object itself is much older, generally dated to the early 15th century. Written on vellum and filled with strange illustrations, it contains page after page of an unknown script that no one has conclusively deciphered. Its contents appear organized, deliberate, and internally consistent. There are botanical drawings of plants that do not clearly match known species, diagrams that resemble astrological or cosmological systems, and scenes of nude female figures interacting with pools, tubes, and structures that seem symbolic, medical, ritualistic, or all three at once. It looks like a book that should yield to interpretation, and yet it does not. That is the source of its power. Many undeciphered inscriptions survive from the past, but the Voynich manuscript feels different because it is so substantial, so intricate, and so insistently book-like. It resembles a coherent system of knowledge. It has repetition, structure, visual categories, and the rhythm of a text that appears to mean something. This is not a random scrap of symbols scratched into stone. It is a full artifact of sustained effort. Someone spent immense time creating it. Someone believed it was worth making. So what is it? The possibilities are almost hypnotic. Some have suggested that it is an encoded work, a deliberately encrypted text meant to conceal medical, alchemical, or esoteric knowledge. Others think it may be written in an unknown or constructed language, perhaps representing ideas in a way no longer recoverable. More skeptical voices argue that it could be an elaborate hoax, a meaningless but carefully crafted fraud designed to impress wealthy collectors or patrons. That explanation sounds attractive until one confronts the sheer labor embedded in the manuscript. Hoaxes usually want quick effect. The Voynich manuscript feels obsessively deep, as though it was built not just to fool the eye, but to survive scrutiny. And that is what makes it so difficult to dismiss. Because if it is nonsense, it is unusually disciplined nonsense. If it is a code, it is one that has outlived generations of brilliant attempts to break it. If it is a lost language or symbolic system, then it stands as a surviving island from an intellectual world now severed from us almost completely. No solution sits comfortably. Every theory explains something and leaves something else untouched. That lingering gap is where the manuscript becomes genuinely unnerving. It forces us to confront a possibility history does not enjoy admitting, that a text can survive physically while becoming culturally dead. Not damaged, not partially understood. Dead. Its pages remain, its symbols remain, its patterns remain. But the chain of interpretation is gone. The teachers, readers, and context that once made it intelligible have vanished so thoroughly that the book now exists among us like an artifact from a sealed civilization of one. The Voynich manuscript may not break the timeline through impossible technology or forbidden machinery. It breaks it in another way. It reminds us that knowledge can be lost so completely that even when the object survives, meaning does not. And there is something deeply frightening about that. Because once you accept it, the manuscript stops looking like an exotic puzzle and starts looking like evidence of how fragile understanding really is. Number 5. The Saqqara bird. At first glance, the Saqqara bird is almost modest. It is small, carved from wood, and easily overshadowed by the monumental scale of ancient Egypt's better-known wonders. But that modesty may be part of what makes it so provocative. Because some objects do not need to be large to destabilize assumptions. They only need to look just strange enough that people cannot agree on what they are seeing. The artifact was discovered in 1898 in a tomb at Saqqara and is generally dated to around the 3rd or 2nd century BCE. It resembles a bird in simplified form, but with proportions that have fascinated generations of observers. Its wings are straight rather than feathered in a naturalistic way. Its body is streamlined. Its vertical tail has an almost engineered look to it. To many, it appears less like a symbolic bird and more like a model glider. That single impression changed everything. Once people began comparing the object to principles of flight, the Saqqara bird was pulled into a far more explosive conversation. Was this merely a stylized, carved bird, perhaps a toy, a ritual item, or a decorative object? Or was it something stranger, a representation, however crude, of aerodynamic knowledge far ahead of its time? To believers in lost ancient technology, the artifact became a tantalizing clue that the Egyptians may have understood gliding or flight concepts in ways history does not fully credit. It is an intoxicating theory, and one that survives because the object does invite the comparison. Experiments and reconstructions have added fuel to the fire. Some have modified replicas, adding missing stabilizing elements and testing whether the form could glide. In certain versions, the answer has seemed encouraging enough to keep speculation alive. But critics point out something important. Altering a replica to make it fly does not prove the original was intended as an aircraft model. It may only prove that the human mind is excellent at imposing engineering purpose onto ambiguous shapes. Many archaeologists remain unconvinced that the Saqqara bird was anything more than a stylized artifact interpreted through modern fascination with aviation. That skepticism is fair. And still, the artifact refuses to become ordinary. Because even if the mainstream explanation is correct, the Saqqara bird reveals how easily an ancient object can brush against modern categories in unsettling ways. It is not simply that people want it to be a glider. It is that its form is close enough to trigger that desire at all. Close enough to raise uncomfortable questions about how design, observation of nature, and practical experimentation may have interacted in ancient minds. Ancient craftsmen did not need to invent aircraft to study balance, symmetry, lift-like behavior, or the elegance of forms that moved through air. They only needed curiosity. That may be the real heart of the mystery. The Saqqara bird does not necessarily prove forgotten aviation, but it does remind us how quickly we underestimate ancient intelligence when it does not announce itself in familiar modern terms. A carved object can sit in silence for centuries, dismissed as decorative, only for later generations to realize it may encode a more sophisticated sense of motion and structure than anyone initially assumed. Whether it was symbolic, experimental, or simply coincidentally aerodynamic, it survives as one of those rare artifacts that makes the boundary between imagination and technology feel less stable than we would like. And perhaps that is why it earns its place here. Because the most unsettling timeline-breaking objects are not always the ones that clearly prove the impossible. Sometimes they are the ones that hover just at the edge of explanation, close enough to reason to remain plausible, but strange enough to make certainty feel arrogant. Number 4. The London Hammer. Some objects become mysterious because they are beautiful. Others become controversial because they appear to violate the most basic logic of time itself. The so-called London Hammer belongs to that second category. It is not elegant, and it is not subtle. It is simply a hammer that, according to the most sensational version of its story, was found embedded in ancient rock, as though a human-made tool had somehow become trapped inside geology far older than humanity should allow. Few claims are more explosive than that. The story most often repeated is that in 1936, near London, Texas, a hammer-like object was discovered partly enclosed in a concretion or rock formation. At first glance, that may sound merely unusual, but over time the tale expanded into something far stranger. Some began claiming that the surrounding stone was hundreds of millions of years old, implying that the hammer itself must be impossibly ancient. If true, it would not just challenge accepted history, it would destroy it. Human craftsmanship, industrial-style metallurgy, and a shaped wooden handle appearing in a context older than dinosaurs would force a complete collapse of the conventional timeline. That possibility is exactly why the object became famous. It has long been embraced by those who argue that mainstream archaeology and geology conceal evidence of a radically different past. In that telling, the London Hammer becomes proof of an ancient civilization, a forgotten technological age, or even a catastrophic rewriting of Earth's history. The object's simple form only makes the claim more dramatic. This is not some ambiguous carving or symbolic relic. It looks like a tool, familiar, functional, wrongly placed, and yet the deeper one looks, the less stable the sensational claim becomes. The key issue is the surrounding material. Concretions can form around objects over relatively short geological timescales under the right conditions. A modern or historic object can become enclosed in mineral deposits and later appear far older than it really is to a casual observer. That means the most extraordinary interpretation depends almost entirely on assuming that the stone around the hammer represents the age of the hammer itself. Critics have long argued that this assumption is deeply flawed, and that the object is far more likely to be an old but not impossibly ancient hammer caught within a natural process that made it look prehistoric. That explanation is far more likely. But even here, the London Hammer remains revealing, because its endurance says something important about the human relationship with anomalous objects. We are drawn to artifacts that seem to expose a crack in official knowledge, especially when the object is ordinary enough to feel undeniable. A machine might be debated, a manuscript might be reinterpreted, but a hammer is a hammer. It speaks the language of direct use. It feels like a witness. That is why people want the London Hammer to be impossible. It embodies the dream that one misplaced object could overturn entire institutions of certainty. In the end, it probably does not break the timeline in any literal sense, but it does illuminate how fragile our trust in timelines can be. One object in the wrong context, one story repeated often enough, and suddenly the past begins to feel unstable. The London Hammer may not be evidence of prehistoric industry, but it is evidence of something else. How eager we are to believe that history has hidden rooms, sealed chambers, and forbidden truths waiting to be struck open. Number 3. The Roman dodecahedrons. Some ancient mysteries are dramatic the moment you see them. Others are quiet, almost understated, and become stranger the longer you think about them. The Roman dodecahedrons belong to that second kind of mystery. They do not look like weapons, sacred idols, or magnificent treasures. They look like puzzles. Small hollow objects made of bronze or stone, usually with 12 pentagonal faces and circular holes of varying sizes cut into each side. Roman dodecahedrons have been found across parts of the former Roman Empire, especially in regions like Gaul and Britain. Most date to the 2nd or 3rd century CE. Many have knobs at each corner, giving them a distinct geometric appearance unlike almost anything else recovered from the Roman world. And despite decades of discovery and discussion, no one knows for certain what they were for. That uncertainty is what makes them so unnerving. The Roman world left behind roads, forts, inscriptions, coins, engineering works, household goods, military equipment, and an enormous documentary legacy. We know a great deal about Rome compared to many other ancient civilizations. So when a recurring object appears in multiple sites, clearly crafted with intention, and yet remains functionally unidentified, it creates a rare kind of historical embarrassment. It is not a mystery born from total silence. It is a mystery born from partial familiarity. We know the civilization, we know the era, we know the material culture, and still these objects slip through our fingers. The theories are endless. Some have argued that the dodecahedrons were measuring devices, perhaps used in surveying or to estimate distances. Others think they may have served ritual or religious purposes, their strange form tied to symbolism now lost. Some suggest they were decorative holders, gaming pieces, astronomical tools, candle supports, or textile instruments used in glove-making. Nearly every proposal explains one feature and fails to account for another. The varying hole sizes imply intentional design, but to what end? The knobs suggest handling or mounting, but for what purpose? Their distribution hints at cultural significance, but the absence of definitive written explanation leaves every answer hovering just short of confidence. That is where the true power of the dodecahedrons lies. They force us to admit that even within one of the best documented civilizations of the ancient world, there are categories of objects whose meanings can vanish almost completely. A tool can survive while its instructions perish. A ritual item can remain intact while the belief system around it dissolves. A common object can become alien simply because the habits that once made it obvious have disappeared. The Roman dodecahedrons feel like artifacts from a parallel version of Rome, one just close enough to touch, but not close enough to understand. And that makes them feel like they break the timeline in an unusual way. Not because they prove impossible technology or hidden science, but because they expose a hole in historical continuity where certainty should be. We expect mystery in prehistoric caves and lost deserts. We do not expect it in the heart of the Roman world. Yet here it is, a repeated deliberate object from a civilization we think we know, still refusing to tell us what it was. That silence is far more disturbing than any easy answer. Because once an object like this exists, the past no longer feels securely interpreted. It feels inhabited by missing meanings. And the Roman dodecahedrons, with their elegant geometry and stubborn refusal to explain themselves, may be among the clearest reminders that even the most studied civilizations still contain locked compartments history has not yet learned how to open. Number 2. The Baghdad Battery. There are some artifacts that become controversial because they are incomplete. A fragment survives, but its context does not. A vessel remains, but its purpose has drained away with the centuries. The so-called Baghdad Battery is one of the most famous examples of that kind of mystery, and few ancient objects have done more to provoke the unsettling question of whether the past may have experimented with forces we consider distinctly modern. The object, or rather the group of objects tied to this name, was reportedly discovered near Baghdad, and is usually associated with the Parthian or Sasanian world. It consists of a clay jar containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod. On paper, that description may sound mundane, but when assembled in the modern imagination, it becomes something far more explosive. Because the arrangement resembles a simple galvanic cell. Add an acidic liquid such as vinegar or grape juice, and the device can produce a small electric current. That possibility changed everything. Suddenly, what might have been a container, a ritual object, or some otherwise ordinary crafted item was recast as evidence of ancient electricity. The idea was irresistible. Had people in the ancient Near East discovered electrochemical principles long before the modern era claimed them? Had they used such devices for electroplating, medicine, ritual sensation, or some lost practical purpose now stripped of explanation? If so, the artifact would not merely be interesting. It would represent one of the most dramatic examples of forgotten technological knowledge ever uncovered. And that is exactly why the Baghdad battery has remained suspended between fascination and skepticism for decades. Because while the electrochemical interpretation is possible in a narrow experimental sense, possibility is not proof of historical use. Modern reconstructions can generate small currents, yes. But that only shows that the arrangement can function in that way, not that it was intended to. Archaeology is full of objects that can be made to do things their makers never imagined. The real question is not whether the jar could act like a battery. It is whether there is convincing evidence that ancient people meant it to. That is where certainty begins to dissolve. There is no surviving text clearly describing such a device as an electrical instrument. There is no indisputable chain of associated tools or workshop remains that settles the matter. Alternative explanations remain on the table, including the possibility that the object served some storage, ritual, or symbolic purpose unrelated to electricity. And yet the electrical hypothesis refuses to die, because the artifact's form is just suggestive enough to keep the imagination alive. The copper, the iron, the enclosed design, the tantalizing sense of mechanism. It all feels too close to a battery for comfort. That discomfort is the real story. The Baghdad battery sits exactly at the border where archaeology becomes myth-making. On one side lies disciplined caution, insisting that resemblance is not evidence. On the other lies the thrill of rupture, the seductive belief that one object may reveal an entire chapter of scientific experimentation buried beneath official history. Most likely, the truth is more complicated than either extreme. Perhaps the artifact had a purpose we no longer recognize. Perhaps it belonged to a practical tradition whose principles were understood experimentally rather than theoretically. Or perhaps its modern fame says more about our hunger for lost knowledge than about the object itself. But even with that caution in place, the Baghdad battery remains deeply provocative. Because it reminds us that history is most dangerous, not when it delivers clear impossibilities, but when it presents us with objects that can almost sustain them. The jar does not prove that ancient civilizations were wiring their world with electricity, but it does something subtler and more enduring. It forces us to confront how much can be lost between an object and its meaning, and how quickly an artifact with the right shape can turn the past into a battlefield between skepticism and wonder. Number 1. The Antikythera mechanism. Some discoveries are mysterious, some are controversial, and then there are discoveries so extraordinary that even after they are explained, they still feel impossible. The Antikythera mechanism belongs to that final category. Recovered in fragments from a shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera in the early 20th century, the device at first did not look like something that should transform our understanding of the ancient world. It was corroded, broken, and easy to mistake for an unremarkable mass of bronze and decay. But as researchers studied it more closely, a different picture began to emerge. Hidden inside the encrusted fragments was a complexity no one expected to find in an artifact from the ancient Mediterranean. Gears, interlocking precision gears, not a simple tool, not a decorative curiosity, a machine. Dated to around the 2nd or 1st century BCE, the Antikythera mechanism is now understood as an astonishing analog device used to model astronomical cycles. It could track celestial motions, predict eclipses, and represent relationships between solar, lunar, and likely planetary patterns with extraordinary sophistication. In essence, it was a kind of ancient computational instrument, a machine built to translate cosmic order into mechanical motion. That sentence still does not feel fully real. because it forces a confrontation with one of the most misleading habits in popular history: the tendency to imagine technological progress as smooth, obvious, and irreversible. The Antikythera mechanism shatters that illusion. It appears in the ancient world with a level of miniaturized gearing and mathematical design so advanced that for a long time, many people simply could not believe it belonged where it was found in time. It felt like a device from a much later age, as though a Renaissance workshop or even an early modern scientific mind had somehow reached backward into antiquity. But it did belong there, and that may be the most unsettling part of all. Because once the mechanism is accepted as authentic, history becomes more complicated in a way that cannot be easily reversed. The device did not emerge from nowhere. Something this intricate implies traditions of design, craftsmanship, astronomical knowledge, and engineering skill behind it. It suggests teachers, workshops, lost prototypes, failed experiments, and perhaps other machines that did not survive. The Antikythera mechanism is not just an isolated marvel. It is evidence of an intellectual and technical environment richer than the surviving record would have led most people to imagine. That realization is almost haunting. If one such machine survived by accident at the bottom of the sea, how many others were lost? How many devices were melted down, broken apart, or allowed to vanish because later ages no longer understood or valued them? How much ancient sophistication has disappeared not because it never existed, but because its materials were fragile, expensive, and easy to erase? The Antikythera mechanism makes those questions unavoidable. And it does something even more profound. It changes the emotional shape of the past. Ancient people stop looking like distant figures fumbling toward knowledge in primitive darkness. Instead, they appear as minds capable of abstraction, precision, and engineering elegance at a level that can still inspire disbelief. The mechanism does not just reveal technical skill, it reveals continuity between their intelligence and ours, while also exposing how much of that continuity has been broken by loss. That is why the Antikythera mechanism deserves the #1 position. Not because it proves aliens, forbidden science, or some fantasy of secret civilizations. It earns this place because it is real, because it is documented, and because it still feels like a violation of expectation even after modern scholarship has helped explain it. It is not merely an ancient object that seems to break the timeline. It is an ancient object that proves the timeline was never as simple as we wanted it to be.